Avengers Doomsday is clearly the most anticipated movie of the year, but it's not the only event. As you may know, Marvel has decided to re-release Avengers Endgame in theaters on September 23. So first of all, that's great news. Maybe a lot of you never had the chance to see it in a theater packed with fans. But more importantly, it's huge news because the Russo brothers have decided not to just re-release the movie as it is, they're going to add new elements that connect it directly to Avengers Doomsday. Yes, you heard that right. Doomsday is the direct sequel to Endgame. Even though the MCU has since released 16 movies and more than 27 seasons and specials on Disney, that's over 160 hours of story. Literally double everything that came out before Endgame. Does this mean that the Multiverse Saga is truly an admission of failure, or simply that the Avengers story, which we barely saw throughout the whole saga, only really picks up again today, and that all the storytelling between these two movies is now being handled by the Russo brothers? Above all, this video will explore the hidden plan behind the theatrical re-release and how the Russo brothers will excel at it. Retcon many clues that were originally included to make us think everything was planned from the start. And I'm warning you, there's a lot to analyze, kids, but even more to theorize about. So we're entering the spoiler zone, the danger zone. You're with Kevin Buckott, your favorite theorist's favorite theorist. Opening credits, Kevin the Cops, Kevin the Cops. A few days ago, I gave you the chance to win the biggest contest in the history of the channel for the incredible finale of Season 2 of Daredevil Born Again, exclusively on Disney+. A Daredevil PC bundle assembled by Cybertech in partnership with AMD, Corsair, Samsung and Disney+. And it's Rodolphe who was randomly selected from among the thousands of participants. Congratulations, Rodolphe, but this PC is still available on the Cybertech website and you can get it for yourself. Above all, wait until the end because there's an amazing deal. It's the Devil PC. Here, without the collector module, but with exactly the same performance, devilishly efficient. A PC designed for gaming at 1440p under the best conditions like Matt Murdock, without compromise. And in this beast, you'll find an AMD Radeon RX 9600 XT graphics card, combined with an AMD Ryzen 5 7500F processor. A perfect setup for playing your 8A games at 1440p with boosted performance thanks to AI, especially through AMD FSR 4 technology. For RAM, there's Corsair Vengeance DDR516GB at 5600 MHz. So, a Corsair RM750E Gold 750W power supply, and to keep a cool head in any situation, like Daredevil, there's the Corsair Nautilus 240 RGB liquid cooling system. Not to mention storage, with the Samsung SSD 9100 Pro 1TB NVMe Gen 5. In short, a PC that truly lives up to its name. A coherent, high-performance setup with a solid AMD foundation, premium Corsair components, and an ultra-fast Samsung SSD. Just as effective for gaming as it is for working in excellent conditions. But wait, if I'm telling you all this, it's because there's a really great deal. By using my link in the description and in the first comment, Corsair's got a treat for you. For just €1 more, Corsair adds a complete gaming pack for you. Keyboard, mouse and headset. Yes, you heard that right, just €1. I didn't lie to you. The pack includes the Corsair K55 RGB Pro keyboard, the Corsair Qatar Pro XT mouse, and the Corsair HS35 V2 Red headset. In short, everything you need to start your first game, as soon as the PC is set up. So, if, like the thousands of people who entered the contest, you unfortunately didn't win the custom Art of War Born Again Season 2 PC, but you really want to invest in a gaming PC, this offer is for you. Alright, let's get back to the video. An admission of failure. That's exactly the phrase that was everywhere when Robert Downey Jr.'s return was announced to play the greatest villain in the Marvel Universe. Out goes Jonathan Majors, a complete disaster, along with his legal troubles. Gone are the characters and actors that Marvel failed to use properly throughout the saga. It's back to the good old ingredients that made the formula we all loved so much. On July 27, 2024, during the famous Marvel panel at Hall H of San Diego Comic-Con, no one really knew how to take this news. Some were excited, others frustrated. But 2 years have passed, and it's clear to say that the MCU has definitely turned things around. The era from 2022 to early 2025 was probably Marvel's worst years. Except for a few exceptions like Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 3 and Deadpool and Wolverine, Phases 4 and 5 gave us massive flops that almost brought the whole empire down. Come on, let's make a list for fun. Thor, Love and Thunder, She-Hulk, Quantumania, Secret Invasion, The Marvels, Echo, The Miserable Captain America, Brave New World, and the shaky Season 1 of Daredevil, Born Again, blech. I threw up. Since then, it looks a lot better. Thunderbolts, Fantastic Four, First Step, Wonder Man, The Punisher Special, and of course the highly anticipated Spider-Man, Brand New Day, and Avengers Doomsday. But the subject of our video isn't the future, it's actually the past. Because in the middle of this comeback is the re-release next September of the franchise's biggest box office hit, Avengers Endgame, which originally came out in 2019. So, the grumpiest among you will say that this is just to make as much money as possible and overtake Avatar again. And well, even though I think deep down Kevin Feige hopes to get ahead again, the truth lies elsewhere. And that's something the Russo brothers have been hammering home everywhere for the past few weeks. While everyone, including them, had presented Endgame to us as the end of the MCU and the Avengers as we knew them, the urgency to get the money machine rolling again completely changes the narrative. Now, Doomsday picks up where Endgame left off. Even better, the chosen marketing angle is that it's the direct sequel to Endgame. In fact, we can go a little further. Endgame becomes, let's say it, the prequel to Doomsday, which changes absolutely everything. It's no longer the victory over Thanos and Tony's sacrifice that launches the new beginning promised in 2020, but rather the Doomsday and Secret Wars duo. But then, what about these last few years? What have we truly experienced in the Multiverse Saga? Did all of this end up being for nothing? To understand this radical shift, we need to quickly review the MCU after Endgame. Avengers Endgame wraps up 10 years of the Infinity Saga, and Spider-Man Far From Home is the last film of Phase 3. Even now, it's the only film that truly addresses Tony Stark's sacrifice and the snap's consequences. But it has to be said that COVID didn't help. We're not going to go over the list of excuses that made Marvel mess things up, but COVID really caused a lot of chaos, especially on the series side, with the launch of Disney Plus and 3 major projects that promised a lot. WandaVision follows Infinity War and Endgame, but filming was halted by the pandemic, leading to a reworked finale without Doctor Strange, who was originally meant to connect to his movie. Falcon and the Winter Soldier was supposed to deal with the consequences of half the population returning, with a pandemic and vials of super serum hidden in the vaccines. Ouch, things go wrong. A messy project that was completely reworked. Only Loki ends up unscathed. The series is a direct follow-up to the Time Heist and remains to this day the only truly viable project that the Russos will use in Doomsday as a reference point. Because Phase 4 is ultimately pretty forgettable. The post-Endgame MCU suffers terribly from a lack of cohesion. Some projects barely connect to each other, but the coherence and overall momentum of a shared story have been completely lost. And yet, as I said in the introduction, there are twice as many hours of content. On the movie side, it's overall flat. Black Widow arrives 5 years late, sure, but it at least introduces characters who are now new Avengers. Shang-Chi introduces us to a new member of the Avengers who will never be seen again. The Eternals, which no one has managed to categorize, still bring in Arisham's Judgment, who is capable of launching an Avengers-type event like Mio Blackheart, and Wakanda Forever is a gigantic tribute to Chadwick Boseman, which, in the end, doesn't really move anything forward. What? I didn't talk about Love and Thunder, but here you go. Only 2 exceptions. No Way Home, the first to discuss the multiverse, finally does a consequence-free variant orgy. Everyone returns home, and the only real change is that no one remembers Peter and You Try to Help Me. But it launches the soft reboot of the character who, in the end, was also pretty poorly used after Post-Endgame, and Multiverse of Madness, which remains to this day the most multiverse-compatible movie in the whole saga. The variants make sense. We discover new universes. Concepts are explained. The only movie that actually tried at some point to move things forward, on the series side, after a thunderous start in 2021-2022, took the gamble of introducing new characters directly on the small screen, and we can say that gamble failed. Moon Knight is a one-shot despite being loved by fans. Miss Marvel becomes the nerd's favorite, but the general public doesn't care, and She-Hulk is a real disaster, even though Hulk and Daredevil appear in it. Okay, and Echo at least brings back Wilson Fisk, even though honestly the way he's handled is clearly shameful. And then there's Secret Invasion, a production nightmare. They turned one of the most adaptable Avengers storylines into a low-budget series. And the plot, triggering a global nuclear war after a Skrulls false flag attack in Moscow, ended up being overtaken just weeks before release by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Bad luck, they had to redo it all. It was a mess. As a result, Marvel completely ignores the series as if it never existed. They even managed to mess up a character like Fury. That's impressive. Luckily, Loki Season 2 is coming and offers a real breath of fresh air. Except that, well, Jonathan Majors has his legal troubles, and the only interesting setup for the overall story, He Who Remains, Kang, and his council, is going to be reduced to dust. Kang becomes the glaring absence, the big loser of all these years, or maybe we're the real losers here. A villain who had incredible potential, but was used too timidly, and who today is completely erased from all communication, as if he never existed, starting with The Purge, Ant-Man, and the Wasp. As for Quantumania, which ended his arc in yet another shameful way. And no, I believe less and less that there will be any mention of the Council in Doomsday. In the same continuity, The Marvels is the follow-up to the Secret Invasion mess, and the studio's biggest flop, since nobody knew the characters introduced in the series. But the ending matters for Doomsday, because that's when we meet the X-Men. Deadpool and Wolverine set the characters on the multiversal chessboard. And finally, Captain America, Brave New World, Thunderbolts, and Fantastic Four set up the teams needed for Doomsday. What we need to remember is that, deep down, most of the projects have no real connection to each other and contribute very little to the overall story. The Multiverse Saga collapsed with Kang and never bounced back. It launched storylines in every direction, giving too much creative freedom to too many different people, without a clear vision, and it lost coherence. Yes, to conclude, it's not just an admission of failure, it's a crushing defeat. The multiverse has failed, and the Russo brothers have no choice but to ignore the so-called storylines left over the past 7 years and only focus on the surface, the characters introduced and where they are now. As for the rest, the underlying plot, the only remaining common thread is Endgame, its heist, and its consequences. So, an admission of failure? For me, yes, definitely. But maybe it's necessary, even pragmatic, since we've reached the point of bringing back the first X-Men, whose last movie was in 2014. And that's where it's pretty impressive. The Russo brothers' influence is so strong at Marvel that they decide not to try to fix this mess, but to start again directly from their last project. So Doomsday isn't the conclusion of the last 7 years of a struggling saga, but rather the consequences of the time heist, Tony's sacrifice, and Steve's unexplained disappearance that they left unresolved in Endgame. These elements become the catalysts for the collapse of the multiverse. So the Russo brothers decided to make Doomsday the continuation of the characters who had actually completed their arcs in Endgame. And as Daniel RPK says, we're once again returning to an RDJ versus Evans rivalry, the two heroes who come to save the MCU. However, even though RDJ says new mask, same task, what really made the fans upset was the lack of preparation in introducing such an important character as Doom. Unlike Thanos, who was teased for years, we've never had the slightest hint of the greatest villain in the Marvel universe in this saga. And I choose my words carefully. Well, actually, yes, in the Fantastic Four, but honestly, it wasn't anything to write home about. And even though insiders have already said that his physical resemblance won't be mentioned in Doomsday, he's still going to need a launch pad, and this Endgame re-release is definitely here for that. But rest assured, if there's one thing the Russo brothers know how to do above all else, it's making use of foreshadowing and retcons. These two English terms describe how small details in some movies impact larger sagas. And when it comes to that, the Russo brothers, it's simple. 80 of my short video theories are observations of their work. Let's take an example. In Captain America, Civil War, the Sokovia Accords end up splitting the team in two. On one side of the table, the Avengers we'll see again in Endgame. On the other, those who will be snapped or even wiped out by Thanos. It's a small detail, sure, but it's foreshadowing, a setup confirmed by Joe Russo as the event that made them lose in Infinity War. By the way, he often talks about their 4 MCU movies as being conceived and made as a single project. Everything is a consequence. Everything connects. Basically, you use an element from the past, planned or not, to say that it helped predict the future. It's a treat for geeks like me. On the other hand, retcons or retroactive continuity use an element from the past and justify it in a present or future project. And in this case, there are plenty of examples. The 10 Rings and Trevor's role in Shang-Chi. The fact that we learn in Captain America, the Winter Soldier, that SHIELD was infiltrated by Hydra from the very beginning, which completely changes how we see the events of Phase 1. Or even the whole story of the Infinity Stones imagined by James Gunn for the Guardians of the Galaxy, which totally recontextualizes the Tesseract and the Chitauri Scepter. You see, it's not that hard. The Russo brothers know what they're doing, and they probably wrote Doomsday with all the connections to Endgame in mind, but don't worry, we're going to look into it. The re-release of Endgame. It's in this context that Marvel and the Russo brothers plan to re-release the studio's latest huge project, Avengers Endgame. But with a little twist. It's not just about refreshing your memory. No, you won't see exactly the same movie on September 23rd. Obviously, they're not going to fundamentally change the story, but Joe Russo confirmed that this release will be accompanied by completely new scenes that will set up the events of Avengers Doomsday. For him, it's the perfect opportunity to create a bridge connecting these two movies. But one sentence is puzzling. He uses the term critical companion story. In other words, an essential companion story. This Endgame re-release is unusual, as re-releasing movies in theaters is costly. People already know the movie, so you have to make sure that enough people go back to see it. We can compare what's happening here to how George Lucas has updated the Star Wars trilogies over the years, improving special effects and occasionally altering small details. In short, the question that arises is, do we need to go back to the theater to understand Doomsday? Well, probably yes and no. We understand from the Russo brothers' interviews that the footage that will be added won't just be deleted scenes, but actually new footage shot during the filming of Doomsday. Probably footage that will show us the consequences of the film on the multiverse. Maybe where Captain went, or even introduce Victor Von Doom. Anyway, it's either during this re-release or during Doomsday, and I actually think that's what they don't want. Let's take an example of what they've already set up to tease their next film. First, they're the ones who made the post-credits scenes for the last two Marvel movies. First in Thunderbolts, where we see the team 14 months later in their headquarters. Here, they introduce the fact that Sam's Avengers are formed, that they're handling a crisis in space, and that the Fantastic Four are arriving in the 616. Then, they were also the ones who made the post-credits scene of First Step with the very first appearance of Doom. But that's not all, because with the release of Avatar 3, as you know, the Russo brothers gave us 4 teasers. The first one shows Steve Rogers, now a new dad, in 2 different houses and therefore at 2 different times. We'll come back to that right after. But also Thor with love, who prays to his father to give him the strength to defeat a new enemy, the X-Men in a ruined mansion, ready to face a huge threat. And finally, the meeting between Talokan, the Wakandans, and the Fantastic Four in what appears to be an exposed Talokan. And these 4 teasers were accompanied by a little comment. What you've been watching for 4 weeks are not teasers or trailers. They're stories. They're clues. Pay attention. Hashtag Doomsday has begun. I believe all this is basically tied to the Endgame re-release. At least, a part of it. Yes, Doomsday has already begun. Not after Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness or Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, but actually in Endgame. In reality, this movie is no longer the conclusion of the Infinity Saga. That was Avengers Infinity War. Endgame now becomes the true beginning of the Multiverse Saga, which gives us a whole new perspective even without any added scenes. So, I suggest we try to reinterpret what the last Avengers movie is actually telling us, and especially how it could already impact the events of Doomsday. So the movie begins in 2023, 5 years after the defeat in Infinity War. Scott Lang, trapped in the quantum realm, manages to escape thanks to our buddy, the Rat. He realizes that those 5 years in the real world were only 5 hours for him. He thinks he traveled through time, when in reality it's just that time doesn't pass the same way in the quantum realm. It's quantum physics logic like the black hole in the Fantastic Four. Anyway, that's not today's topic. So he decides to play with the quantum realm to try to go back to the past. But the rules are set and clear from the start. Changing the past won't affect the present. It will create an alternate future. We thought this was just an explanation about time travel. But Bruce Banner is already explaining to us the concept of branches and alternate universes.
You travel to the past. That past becomes your future, and your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future.
An explanation later developed by the Ancient One during the trip to New York, where she explains to us that if an event changes, the entire fate of that timeline or universe changes as well. A branch is created and evolves on its own. Here is where we realize the multiverse concept truly starts, which in the end is the most detailed explanation of the events of the collapse we've had so far. As for Loki, so we have the Avengers splitting up to go get the stones, each time creating new branches. In short, it's this event that created the very first chaos in the multiverse and probably the very first incursions. Actually, it's the heist in New York that causes the biggest mess since Loki escapes, leading to his rise as the god of stories. Literally the biggest glitch in the Matrix. And if we want to be picky, yes, we can say that the TVA probably intervened on each of those branches to scramble them before they could cause any damage. Well, yes, but no, because the biggest anomaly remained the 616 since it was useful to He Who Remains. But I have a big theory about that which you're really going to like. Just a little patience, it's coming. Let's get back to Endgame. So the Avengers are going to mess things up and create alternate universes. In 2012 in New York for the Time Stone and the Mind Stone. Then in 1970 at Camp Lehigh for the Space Stone. In 2013 on Asgard, where the Reality Stone and Mjolnir are stolen. And finally in 2014 on Morag for the Power Stone and on Vormir for the Soul Stone. But that's not all, since this timeline also no longer has Thanos. In short, we're seeking those behind the incursions, but in minutes, the Avengers become the main cause, as their actions led to Loki's rise, He Who Remains' elimination, and the TVA losing control of the timelines. But not only that, they also led to Tony's sacrifice with the gauntlet, and especially to Steve Rogers' choice to never return. Yes, he returned, but as an old man with a new shield. Yes, look closely. We had never seen this shield before. Many of the elements already exist. They just need to be made official. The Russos may have already done this. I admit, I didn't think the glitch in the countdown was worth considering. But when you look back at all of this and connect the dots, the 4 glitches all lead to a pivotal moment in the Avengers' actions in Endgame. Trailer 4 leads to the planning of the time heist. Trailer 3 to the moment when Thor and Rocket retrieve Mjolnir. Trailer 2 to Loki stealing the Tesseract and escaping. And finally, Trailer 1 to the Ancient One explaining how a branch is created. They showed us everything, including the famous clues they mentioned. But now, how do we make the connection with Doomsday? Let me remind you, the re-release won't highlight deleted scenes or an extended version, but will actually add completely new scenes. All probably dedicated to finally wrapping up all the mysteries left by the Russo brothers that were never revisited by Marvel. Everything, dear friends, leads to Cap. Steve is guilty. The biggest recontextualization is then based on what Steve did during all that time. At the time, all we had was the famous dance he promised, and a Steve who doesn't want to reveal to Sam what really happened. Now, we know that he lived a life with Peggy, and that they had a child together, which probably created a branch. But we still don't know if he returned the stones, how he did it, since at least one of those branches was scrambled by the TVA, nor what he did all that time to come back so old. Just as a reminder, we see that time clearly doesn't have the same effect on super soldiers as it does on the rest of the population. Bucky didn't spend all his time in cryogenic sleep, and he still looks just as good. So our Cap must have really traveled around. Originally, Marvel planned a series about Steve and returning the stones. A series supposedly called Nomad, which ultimately never saw the light of day, was cancelled and we never heard about it again. I think the Russo brothers may be setting up a sequence to reveal this mystery, possibly adapting the series in the final minutes of Endgame. But that's not all. There's another rumor that I've always had a hard time believing, but now, connecting all the dots, it makes sense. Last January, the insider My Time to Shine Elo revealed a leak saying that Loki moved Steve off camera in season 2 so that he could live a peaceful life. So, out of context, to me, this scoop sounded totally ridiculous. Why would Loki do something like that? And I have to say, I have a bit of a hard time with My Time to Shine. But now, when you connect the dots, everything becomes clear. In season 2, Loki is a victim of time slipping. He's able to travel through time within his own body and can therefore change his own future. Unlike the rules established before, in the TVA, there is no creation of branches. We are outside of time and space. So he spends centuries looking for a solution, learning more about physics to solve the multiversal crisis, and he ends up deciding to sacrifice himself. From the first episode of season 1, he realized the Avengers traveled through time and caused his arrest. And probably in season 2, during all those years of searching for solutions, he must have realized that this event is also the cause of everything. But Renslayer is clear. This event is planned by He Who Remains. The problem is, it's also this event that is the origin of his own existence. So he can't erase it because that wouldn't solve anything. He Who Remains would stay in place and nothing would change. But he can try to limit its impact, and that's where moving Steve to a universe where he doesn't exist makes sense. Not to do him a favor, but simply to try to save what can be saved. And that universe is 828, a universe that strangely never experienced the Cold War. A utopian world where, as early as the 1960s, the world seems at peace and technology thrives. You don't see the connection? We all know Steve, we love him, but we know he can't resist his oversized sense of honor. In my opinion, there is no world where Steve witnesses the world's decline without taking action, so he will probably have a major influence on the fate of this universe, if only to give his son a brighter future. And we can imagine anything, seeing him take on the role of Nomad as his style in Doomsday suggests, or even, why not, leading an uncorrupted S.H.I.E.L.D. with Peggy. Whatever happens, Steve is important in this universe, and there's a good chance he knows the Fantastic Four and Dr. Doom. That's actually how Doom will notice him. The Russo brothers told us that Victor will have a very practical approach to the multiversal crisis, unlike Reed, who has a more theoretical approach. Doom must know that Steve isn't from his universe. He knows that he's the main cause of the problem. And that's actually what most of the insiders were saying. We also know that Chris Evans was supposed to shoot a post-credits scene for the Fantastic Four, a scene that ultimately was never used. Unless, if you start the movie at exactly 5 minutes and 17 seconds, you see a father and a little boy around 10 or 12 years old watching the Fantastic Four cartoon. And yes, from behind he strangely looks like Steve. And guess which cast member was just announced for Avengers Doomsday? The young 11-year-old actor Wesley Harloway in the presumed role of James Rogers, Captain's son. And if we do the math, let's imagine that Captain goes back to the past, late 1940s, early 50s, as shown in the photos from Peggy's house. Meanwhile, the Fantastic Four movie takes place in 1963. So we can totally imagine that it all fits together, and this scene is set in the opening montage of the Fantastic Four in the late 50s, early 60s. So, the images we saw of Cap with the baby could be happening at the time of the encounter with Loki. By the way, in August 2025, Daniel R. Erbke said that Tom Hiddleston had filmed a scene with Steve and Peggy in their house. So, he is clearly the central point of this whole story. And all of this could be shown to us as early as Endgame or at the beginning of Doomsday with a huge 11-year time jump. So we would have 3 eras. The first, Steve's arrival, the baby. The second, where we see him leaving on a motorcycle, maybe to intervene in Universe 828 as a nomad. And finally, an older version, the one from Doomsday, with the beard 11 years later. And what if I told you it doesn't stop there? Yes, I'm not done with you yet. The Multiversal Trinity. Avengers Doomsday doesn't just connect the universes of the Fantastic Four and the Avengers. No, it also connects the X-Men's universe. In a previous video, I told you that it was hard to really understand which X-Men we were dealing with. Obviously, it's the actors from the first trilogy who are reprising their roles. And Alex Perez said in one of his Q&A sessions that it would be a variant of the original Fox timeline, the one that leads to Days of Future Past, except here it's a mutant utopia. And that's where it gets really interesting, because Days of Future Past more or less uses the same kind of time heist as Avengers Endgame. The apocalyptic future takes place in 2023, just like Endgame, and Wolverine is able, thanks to Kitty, not to travel back in time physically, but to send his consciousness into his own body. Basically, it's like the time branches in Loki. With the events of Days of Future Past, he cancels the creation of the Sentinels and creates a future where, in 2023, none of the cataclysmic events for mutants ever happened. Even better, they are no longer seen by humans as a threat, but as heroes. At least, that's what the end of the movie suggests. So here too, we have an event that must have caused incursions in every direction, and 2023 is the epicenter of this whole affair. Which makes perfect sense with Doomsday, since the movie will focus on the last 3 universes that are about to collide. Earth 616, home of the Avengers, the ones who started this whole mess. Earth 828, which was completely shaken up by Steve Rogers' arrival, and finally Earth 100005, which is not following its apocalyptic trajectory at all, causing countless incursions. 3 universes at the center of the end of the multiverse, all held responsible by Victor Von Doom. The Endgame re-release will likely clarify things, so detailed explanations at the start of Doomsday won't be needed. We assumed Infinity War and Endgame were connected, but it's actually the complete opposite. The first Avengers trilogy covers the team's formation and Thanos' threat, their division in Age of Ultron, and their defeat by Thanos in Infinity War. And a second multiversal trilogy made up of Endgame, Doomsday, and Secret Wars. And I have to say, I find this approach pretty interesting, even if it wasn't the initial plan at all. Finally, since we focused a lot on Captain, there's also the case of RDJ. No, there's very little chance that Endgame or Doomsday will address the fact that Doom has the same face as Stark. It pisses me off, but that's how it is. I don't even know if Steve will have seen that face by then, and even if he has, I don't know if he'll talk to the other Avengers about it or keep it to himself so they don't think it's another Rogers-Stark conflict. But one thing is certain, Endgame is going to give us a teaser. It has to. This is the last chance to do it. There are several options then. The first is the iconic sound of the forge from the very first Iron Man. Obviously at the time, it was a tribute to bring things full circle. But what if that sound actually came from Universe 828? And what if we found ourselves in the armory of Victor Von Doom in Latveria? The latest rumors tell us that part of Doomsday will show us the Avengers facing Doom at his home in Doomstadt. There's a little slip-up from the film's composer Alan Silvestri, who shared a picture in front of a screen displaying Armor Room Doomstadt. In the comics, Doomstadt is the capital of Latveria, and now we're sure that a scene takes place in that room. The perfect link between Stark and Doom. New mask, same task. But another theory has appeared on social media, suggesting that we might see Doom attending Tony's funeral. As I was saying, Victor will have practical knowledge of the end of the multiverse in Doomsday, so he probably traveled through time and the multiverse like Loki to understand the origin of all this. And he saw, like everyone else, that his variant is behind it, him and Captain. This scene would show us that he knows about the 616 and that he sees the Avengers attachment to his variant. Anyway, I don't know about you, but I'm really looking forward to seeing how this turns out. If you enjoyed this and you're new here, I analyze and theorize about Marvel news and pop culture every week, so subscribe if you haven't already. The goal is 300k before Doomsday. And if you want more, I'll leave you with this video that you're going to love.